1942. The Pacific Ocean. Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. In the span of 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the rising sun flag flew over Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and Burma. To the average American newspaper reader, Japan seemed untouchable. Distant islands, fortified coastlines, and a home territory shielded by thousands of miles of ocean. But inside the Pentagon, the question burned: how do you strike an enemy so far away? U.S. Army Air Forces already had heavy bombers, the B-29 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. These machines had carried war to Europe, pounding German factories and rail yards. But against Japan, they faced a brutal reality. The Pacific distances dwarfed European geography. From Hawaii to Tokyo was nearly 4,000 miles. Even from newly captured bases in the Marianas, the target cities would still lie over 500 miles away. The existing bombers could not carry the necessary loads and return safely. Japan's cities, its industry, its military production, seemed out of reach. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, understood the stakes. If America could not reach Japan, the war might drag on for years. The Navy could strangle shipping island by island, but Tokyo would remain unscathed. To end the war, Arnold argued, America needed something radically new, a bomber capable of flying higher, farther, and faster than anything before it. A machine that could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs across entire oceans and cruise at an altitude of 32,000 feet, far beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters and flak batteries. This was not just an idea. It was a directive. By 1942, Boeing engineers were working under extraordinary secrecy on what was internally called Project Superfortress. The scale was staggering: billions of dollars invested, thousands of workers sworn to silence, and the full weight of America's industrial capacity turned toward a single goal: creating the weapon that could bring fire to the heart of Japan. The soldiers who would one day climb into its pressurized fuselage did not yet know its name. But whispers spread across training fields: a bomber so advanced it could end the war by itself. The Japanese, still celebrating victories in Burma and New Guinea, had no idea that their greatest nightmare was already being forged in American factories. The stage was set. Fire from the sky was coming. Seattle, Washington, 1940. Even before Pearl Harbor, Boeing engineers were sketching the outlines of a bomber unlike any the world had ever seen. The U.S. Army Air Corps had issued a radical specification: a machine capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs more than 3,000 miles, cruising at altitudes above 30,000 feet, and defended by remote-controlled gun turrets. It would be larger than any bomber yet built, and more expensive than any military aircraft in history. The project soon consumed staggering resources. By war's end, the B-29 program would cost nearly $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project itself. At the height of production, more than 60,000 workers labored across 4 massive plants in Kansas, Georgia, Nebraska, and Washington. Entire assembly lines were built from scratch, with new tools and techniques invented simply to accommodate the bomber's immense size. The B-29's wings stretched 141 feet, its fuselage over 99 feet long, dwarfing the B-17s and B-24s that came before. Technically, it was a marvel of innovation. For the first time, crews would fly in pressurized compartments, insulated from the icy altitudes above 30,000 feet. A central tunnel allowed movement between the forward and rear crew stations. Instead of manually aimed turrets, the B-29 employed a revolutionary central fire control system. Gunners sat at plexiglass stations, sighting with periscopes that relayed data to remote-controlled .50 caliber turrets and even a 20mm cannon in the tail. It was a bomber that seemed to leap a decade into the future. The engineering brilliance carried immense risk. The chosen power plant, the Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone, pushed the limits of piston engine design, generating 2 200 horsepower, but plagued by overheating and fires. Test flights ended in tragedy more than once. One Boeing engineer recalled watching prototypes burst into flames during routine climbs, forcing crews to bail out over Puget Sound. Still, General Hap Arnold pressed forward. "If this airplane fails," he warned, "we lose the war." Despite its dangers, the first prototypes flew in September 1942. By 1943, production models were rolling off the line, each bomber costing nearly $600,000. To the crews who first laid eyes on it, the B-29 seemed impossibly vast. One pilot remembered walking beneath its wings and saying, "It was like standing in the shadow of a battleship, but this one could fly." NTHE Superfortress was real, and soon it would carry America's war all the way to Japan's doorstep. Wichita, Kansas, 1943. NTHE B-29. Superfortress looked like the future of air power, but to the men who flew her in early trials, she was just as likely to be a death trap. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, the most powerful radial piston engines ever mounted on a bomber, delivered more than 200 horsepower each. But they ran hot. Too hot. Mechanics spoke in whispers about the fire problem. Cylinder heads overheated, exhaust valves cracked, and fuel lines leaked. More than one bomber became a flying torch before ever reaching combat altitude, and on test flights over Kansas fields, crews sometimes saw the nacelles glow cherry red. Pilots dreaded the sudden smell of burning oil. A crewman recalled, "You didn't wait to see if it spread. If the firelight came on, you prayed and hoped the extinguisher worked." Too often, it didn't. Entire aircraft were lost. General Hap Arnold himself admitted later, "We lost more men to engine fires in training than we did to the enemy in some months of combat." Beyond the engines, the aircraft was complicated, perhaps too complicated for wartime urgency. The pressurization system leaked, the remote-controlled turrets jammed, and ground crews struggled to master the endless new procedures. One frustrated engineer noted that the B-29 was not just one airplane, but, quote, 1,000 separate innovations bolted together. Every innovation came with risks. And still, the Air Forces pressed forward. Crews trained in Kansas, Nebraska, and New Mexico, flying endless circuits. But accidents were relentless. In 1943 alone, dozens of B-29s crashed before ever leaving American soil. Families received telegrams that said only training accident. For the wives and children, it felt like a cruel waste, death before battle. Yet the program was too important to slow. Despite the carnage, hope remained. Each mishap brought new fixes, each crash new lessons. Wright engineers worked day and night to strengthen engines. Mechanics developed rituals for careful maintenance, inspecting every hose and valve with religious devotion. Slowly, the aircraft became more survivable. The men who survived training began to respect her power. A pilot later said, "If you could keep her flying, she was unmatched. No fighter, no flak could touch you up there at 32,000 feet." NNTHE cost was heavy, but the gamble was working. The Superfortress was becoming battle-ready, and soon it would leave the prairies of Kansas behind and set its course for Asia. Kansas, summer 1943, infields once dotted with wheat were now covered in runways and hangars. The quiet towns of Salina, Pratt, and Great Bend became homes to thousands of young airmen and the most advanced bomber ever built. This was the crucible where the B-29 Superfortress would be molded into a weapon of strategic annihilation. General Henry Hap Arnold had no doubts. The B-17 and B-24 had proven themselves over Europe, but Arnold knew they would never finish the war against Japan. He believed the B-29 was the decisive hammer that could strike directly at the heart of the empire. "This airplane," he told Congress, "is not just another bomber. It is a war-ending weapon." Training was relentless. Across Kansas, rows of gleaming silver bombers lined the aprons. Entire wings were raised at once. Dozens of bases sprang up, each hosting hundreds of flight crews, mechanics, armorers, and support staff. By 1944, more than 30,000 men were connected to the B-29 program in one way or another. Days began before dawn, with briefings on high-altitude navigation, gunnery drills, and emergency procedures. Crews practiced donning oxygen masks and parachutes in seconds, knowing that one mistake at 30,000 feet could mean instant death. And statistics tell the story of scale. Each B-29 carried 11 crewmen, bristling with up to 12.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. It could haul 20,000 pounds of bombs over distances that dwarfed anything before it. To maintain this edge, airmen logged thousands of training hours, flying practice bombing runs across the American Midwest, simulating raids on targets mapped to resemble Japanese cities. NNTHE learning curve was brutal. A single training accident could wipe out an entire crew. But with every month, the formations grew tighter, the bombing patterns more precise, and the confidence stronger. Pilots began to believe in the Superfortress. As one recalled, "At first she terrified us, but the more we flew her, the more we realized she was a giant that only needed taming." NNTHE strategy was clear: high-altitude precision bombing. Japan's war industry, hidden in cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, would be struck with surgical accuracy from altitudes too high for effective interception. It was a bold gamble, and it relied entirely on this new machine's promise. NNTHE airmen were ready, their bases were ready, and across the Pacific, Japan's cities were marked in red on the war room maps. The B-29 was about to be tested in fire. June 5, 1944. Kharagpur Indian engines roared across the sweltering airfield as American aircrews prepared for history's first B-29 combat mission. Their target was Bangkok, Thailand, a rail yard vital to Japanese supply lines. 100 Superfortresses lifted into the humid night, their wings gleaming under the moonlight. For the men on board, it was the culmination of a year's worth of training. For the Japanese, it was the first whisper of a storm that would soon consume their homeland. NNBUT. Before these bombers could strike Japan directly, they faced a logistical nightmare. The nearest bases were in India and western China. To reach Japanese cities, crews had to stage from airstrips around Chengdu. Supplies, fuel, bombs, spare parts, all had to be flown in. That meant flying the Hump, the infamous supply route over the Himalayas. At its lowest, the mountains rose more than 16,000 feet. Storms brewed without warning, winds howled through the passes, and oxygen was thin. C-46 and C-47 transports made the run daily, but even these rugged cargo planes fell victim to the treacherous skies. By 1944, more than 500 aircraft had already been lost in the attempt. Now, the B-29s themselves joined the grind, ferrying their own fuel and munitions before every mission. For each gallon burned on a bombing run, 6 had to be flown in across the Hump. It was an unsustainable equation, but it was the only way. NNTHE first strikes revealed the bomber's power and its fragility. Bomb bays could swallow 20,000 pounds of explosives, and the sight of silver giants cruising at 30,000 feet left Japanese defenders scrambling. Yet many bombs missed their targets, scattered by weather and inexperience. Engine fires still plagued the squadrons. On one mission, 98 planes launched. Barely half reached their objective. A crewman later wrote, "We felt like pioneers, flying into the unknown." Every hour was borrowed time. Still, the message was clear. America could now hit targets in Asia that had once seemed invulnerable. For Tokyo, it was a grim revelation. Though the raids from China were costly and inefficient, they proved the concept. The B-29 was no longer theory. It was in the war, and soon it would not just be Bangkok or rail yards in China. It would be Japan itself, when a new island chain fell into Allied hands. November 24, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands, NTHE tropical dawn broke over the Pacific as ground crews swarmed across a Slido airfield. Lined up on the coral runways were 111 B-29 Superfortresses, their bomb bays packed with high explosives. This was no training mission, no experimental strike on distant rail lines. For the first time, the rising sun of Japan itself was the target. Tokyo, the beating heart of the empire, would feel the thunder of the Superfortress and THE crews strapped in, their oxygen masks hanging at the ready. General Emmett O'Donnell led the formation, determined to show the Japanese capital that America's reach now spanned the Pacific. Engines roared, one after another, until the airfield trembled. Slowly, the giants lifted into the sky, climbing higher and higher until they were invisible specks against the blue. And over Tokyo, civilians looked up in disbelief. At 30,000 feet, the bombers appeared as tiny silver flecks, glinting like stars. For years, Japanese propaganda had assured the public that the homeland was safe, protected by the Imperial Navy and the vast distances of the Pacific. Now, for the first time, air raid sirens screamed across the capital. Families poured into shelters as the bomb bays opened above. THE raid itself was less devastating than hoped. The newly discovered jet stream, blasting at speeds of over 200 miles per hour, scattered bombs far from their intended targets. Explosives meant for aircraft plants fell across suburbs and open fields. Japanese anti-aircraft fire barked into the sky, but the shells burst far below, harmless against the high-flying giants. Fighters scrambled, but by the time they clawed upward, the bombers were already turning for home. THE physical damage was limited, but the psychological impact was profound. For the first time, Tokyo's citizens had seen the war reach their own skies. One Japanese diary recorded, "They came like gods, untouchable in the heavens. We could only watch. NNFOR the Americans. The results were sobering. The bombers had proven they could reach Tokyo, but accuracy was another matter. Still, General Arnold took heart. The message had been delivered. Nowhere in Japan was safe. Back in the Marianas, crews landed exhausted, many shaken by engine failures and flak damage. Yet despite losses, they had achieved the impossible. Tokyo had been bombed, and with that single raid, a new phase of the Pacific War had begun. December 1944, Tokyo airspace, THE first raids had revealed an invisible enemy, one the Americans had not expected, the wind itself. At 30,000 feet, the B-29 Superfortress was supposed to deliver precise strikes on aircraft plants, steelworks, and refineries. But instead of accuracy, bombardiers watched in frustration as bomb patterns drifted wildly off target. Bombs dropped from 32,000 feet were carried miles away by a force no one had yet fully understood. The jet stream, THE winds, howled at speeds of 200 to 250 miles per hour, stronger than anything previously measured in aerial warfare. Crews reported watching entire formations blown off course, compasses and navigators struggling to adjust. Pilots cursed as their aircraft seemed powerless against the unseen torrent. One bombardier wrote, "You could put the bomb sight dead on the target, and when the bombs hit, they landed a mile away." And NFOR the Japanese, it was an unexpected reprieve. Cities, struck with scattered bombs, suffered damage, but nothing like the destruction planners in Washington had envisioned. Civilians in Tokyo spoke of their relief, remarking that the, quote, giant planes seemed to aim poorly despite their terrifying altitude. Japanese propaganda seized on the failures, boasting that divine winds once again protected the homeland, a chilling echo of the kamikaze typhoons that had repelled the Mongols centuries before. Yet the Americans refused to accept defeat by weather. Scientists and officers scrambled to study the phenomenon. Meteorologists pored over data, analyzing flight logs and bomb impact maps. It became clear that a new approach was needed. The precision bombing doctrine, so successful in Europe, was faltering in Asia's skies. THE frustration weighed heavily on crews. They had trained for pinpoint raids, drilled in accuracy, and carried the burden of expectations. Instead, their missions often ended in disappointment. with photographs showing bombs scattered across rice paddies instead of assembly plants. The toll on morale was significant. As one pilot later said, "We flew 500 miles, risked our lives, and hit nothing but dirt. It was like punching a ghost." BUT commanders saw opportunity in failure. If the jet stream made high-altitude precision impossible, perhaps the solution was to abandon altitude altogether. It was a gamble, one that would transform the B-29's role, and Japan's fate. NNTHE's stage was set for a new commander, a man willing to tear up the playbook and unleash firestorms from the sky, General Curtis LeMay. January 1945. Guam, Mariana Islands, N.A. stocky general, with a cigar clenched between his teeth, strode into the B-29 command posts. His name was Curtis LeMay, a veteran of the European Air War. He had led daylight bombing campaigns over Germany and knew the brutal arithmetic of attrition. Now in the Pacific, he confronted a different problem. The jet stream had humbled America's most advanced bomber. Accuracy was a myth. Tokyo still stood. LeMay's solution was radical. If bombs could not be aimed with precision from the stratosphere, then precision itself would be abandoned. Instead of striking individual factories, the bombers would burn entire cities. Japan's industry was dispersed, much of it hidden in wooden homes where families wove airplane parts or assembled munitions. Destroy the neighborhoods, LeMay argued, and the workshops would vanish with them. NNTO do this, the B-29s themselves would be stripped. Turrets were removed, machine guns taken out, and armor reduced. Each bomber became a flying torch carrier, able to haul 6 to 7 tons of incendiaries. They would no longer climb to 30,000 feet, but instead attack at night from altitudes as low as 5,000 to 7,000 feet. The risk was immense. Crews would be exposed to anti-aircraft fire and fighters, but LeMay calculated that Japanese defenses were too weak to stop them. NNTHE weapons of choice were M69 incendiary bomblets, small cylinders filled with napalm-like jellied gasoline. A single cluster could ignite an entire block of wooden houses. Dropped by the thousands, they promised not just damage, but inferno. NNNHI's subordinates were shocked. Abandoning high-altitude doctrine seemed reckless, even suicidal. One officer described the mood, "We thought LeMay had gone mad, but then we realized he intended to burn Japan to the ground." LeMay was unapologetic. War, he argued, was about ending the enemy's will to fight. If that meant firestorms over Japanese cities, so be it. The gamble would soon be tested. Orders went out. Prepare the bombers, prepare the incendiaries, prepare the crews for low-altitude night raids. In the months ahead, Japan would discover what LeMay's new doctrine meant. Not scattered bombs carried away by the wind, but walls of flame racing through cities, consuming everything in their path. An NNTHE countdown to Tokyo's Night of Fire had begun. Night of March 9, 1945. Tokyo, Japan. NNTHE City slept under blackout, but in the skies to the east, a storm of fire was gathering. At 5,000 feet over the Pacific, 279 B-29 Superfortresses flew in long black columns, their bellies packed with incendiaries. General Curtis LeMay's gamble was about to be tested. No more high-altitude bombing. No more scattered strikes. Tonight, the bombers would fly low, fast, and merciless, unleashing fire on the largest city in the world, and at 12:08 a.m., the first wave crossed the city limits. Bomb bays yawned open, and thousands of M69 incendiary bomblets rained down. Each canister burst on impact, spraying flaming gel across rooftops and alleyways. Within minutes, fires spread block by block. Then the second wave came, then the third. Soon the eastern districts of Tokyo glowed orange against the night sky. NNFOR civilians on the ground. It was apocalypse. Flames leapt from wooden houses, fed by winds that fanned them into firestorms. Entire neighborhoods ignited at once, the heat so intense that asphalt bubbled and rivers boiled. Survivors described walls of fire racing faster than people could run, Mothers clutched children as fire whirls sucked the air from their lungs. In the chaos, even canals, once thought safe, became death traps as burning debris rained down. NNTHE's scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ashes. At least 100,000 people were dead, burned, suffocated, or drowned while fleeing. More than 1 million civilians were left homeless in a single night. The firestorm's death toll exceeded those of Dresden and Hamburg combined, and even rivaled the destruction that would be wrought later at Hiroshima NFOR, the American crews. The sight was staggering. From their cockpits, Tokyo looked like a single sheet of flame. Some recalled smelling the burning city, even at altitude. One pilot later admitted, "It was like flying over the mouth of hell." Japanese authorities were stunned. The Imperial Army had no defense against this kind of destruction. Anti-aircraft guns could not reach the low-flying bombers in time, and the scattered fighter response was useless. Tokyo, the proud capital, had been turned into a furnace. LeMay's doctrine had been proven, with a fury that shocked even its architects. And worse for Japan, this was only the beginning. March to June 1945. Japan NTHE nightmare that consumed Tokyo on March 9 to 10 did not end with the rising sun. It was only the beginning. General Curtis LeMay had found his weapon, fire. Now he intended to use it everywhere. Across the months that followed, wave after wave of B-29 superfortresses turned Japan's great cities into charnel houses of smoke and ash. On March 12th, Nagoya was struck. Then Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Each raid followed the same pattern: stripped-down bombers flying low at night, bomb bays packed with clusters of M69 incendiaries. Dropped in their tens of thousands, they turned wooden homes into kindling. Factories hidden among civilian blocks were obliterated. Japanese air defenses, already weak, could not adapt. Anti-aircraft batteries struggled to track bombers at low altitude. Fighters scrambled too late, often running out of fuel before intercepting. The result was devastation on an industrial scale. NNTHE numbers were staggering. Between March and June, firebombing destroyed over 60 Japanese cities. In Tokyo alone, 1 million people were left homeless. In Osaka, 8 square miles were incinerated in a single night. Nagoya's industrial districts vanished beneath walls of flame. Kobe, a major port, burned so hot that molten glass pooled in the streets. By summer, an estimated 330,000 civilians had been killed in the fire raids, more than all American combat losses in the Pacific War combined. Eyewitness accounts capture the horror. Survivors described rivers choked with bodies, children lost in smoke, and entire families buried under collapsing homes. A Japanese official wrote bitterly, "We had no air defense, no protection. The sky itself betrayed us." And NFOR, the American crews, the missions became grimly routine. Engines droned through the night as Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka burned below. Crews spoke of the smell of charred wood and flesh reaching into their bomb bays. Some were horrified, others hardened themselves, telling each other this was the only way to end the war without a bloody invasion. NNTHE campaign's scale dwarfed anything seen in Europe. Dresden's firestorm killed 25,000. Hamburg's cost 37,000. In Japan, single raids surpassed both. The Superfortress had transformed from a high-altitude precision machine into the most destructive incendiary weapon in history. In NBY June 1945, vast stretches of urban Japan were nothing but ruins. Yet still, the raids continued. The empire was burning, but its leaders would not surrender. Summer 1945. Across Japan, NTHE, roar of distant engines had become a sound of dread. To millions of Japanese civilians, the B-29 was no longer an airplane. It was a harbinger of death. Even before the bombs fell, its low, steady drones sent families scrambling into shelters, clutching children and precious belongings. For many, survival became a nightly ritual, though few believed they would survive the next raid. Psychological collapse spread faster than fire. Diaries reveal the despair. One Tokyo housewife wrote, "The sound of the planes comes, and we sit in the dark. My children ask if tonight is our turn. I cannot answer." In Osaka, a survivor recorded, "The sky glowed red every night. We knew our city would not exist by morning." The raids had become not just military operations, but instruments of terror, shaking the nation's will to fight. Japan's defenders were equally shaken. Fighter pilots, many barely trained teenagers, climbed into cockpits knowing they had little chance against the Superfortress. At 32,000 feet, the bombers were nearly untouchable. Even when LeMay's low-altitude fire raids began, American formations flew in such overwhelming numbers that interception was futile. Some pilots resorted to ramming attacks, desperate suicides against giants of steel. A few succeeded, but at terrible cost. One Japanese pilot's last recorded words were, "I strike not for victory, but for honor." On the American side, the psychological divide was stark. Crews described their missions with cold detachment, focusing on checklists and formation discipline to avoid dwelling on the destruction below. Yet even at altitude, some confessed unease. A navigator later admitted, "Looking down, it seemed the entire Earth was burning. I wondered if this was still war, or something darker." Still, morale within the U.S. Army Air Forces soared. The B-29s flew deeper and deeper into the empire with impunity. Loss rates dropped below 2% per mission, a fraction of what B-17 crews had endured over Germany. To the men, the Superfortress seemed invincible. To the Japanese below, it was inescapable. In NBY, July, Japan's urban heartland was shattered, its people exhausted. But its leaders still clung to war. Even as homes burned and factories collapsed, Tokyo's military elite refused surrender. The psychological war had broken the people, but not yet the regime. NNTHE Americans now turned to a weapon even more terrible, one that would bring the war to its final reckoning. Spring 1945. Tinian Island, Marianas. As Japan's cities burned under waves of incendiaries, another secret plan was unfolding in the shadows of the Pacific. The B-29, already the most advanced bomber in the world, had been chosen for a mission unlike any in history, to deliver the most devastating weapon ever conceived by man. NNTHE project was codenamed Silverplate. In hidden hangars, select B-29s were stripped, modified, and rebuilt to carry a single massive bomb, one unlike any conventional weapon. These aircraft were lighter, faster, and equipped with specially designed bomb bays to hold the enormous devices. Among them were the Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, and Boxcar, flown by Major Charles Sweeney. NNTHE secrecy was absolute. Crews were told only what they needed to know. Training missions were disguised as ordinary bombing runs, though the loads they carried were strange. Single giant shapes, inert dummies meant to mimic the weight and aerodynamics of what was coming. These were nicknamed pumpkins. Airmen joked uneasily about hauling oversized squash across Japan, never realizing that the real bombs would carry the power of the sun itself. NNTHE Manhattan Project, costing nearly $2 billion, had labored for years to split the atom. Now, the scientists, creation required a delivery system. Only the B-29 had the range, the altitude, and the strength to carry a weapon weighing over 9,000 pounds across the Pacific. Its very existence made the atomic strike possible. Japanese leaders had no inkling of the storm about to break. Intelligence officers assumed the American bombing campaign had reached its peak with the fire raids. Rumors circulated of strange pumpkin bombs destroying single factories, but the significance was missed. The empire still clung to the hope that it could negotiate terms short of unconditional surrender. NNFOR the Americans. The rationale was cold and strategic. An invasion of the Japanese home islands was projected to cost up to 1 million Allied casualties and perhaps even more Japanese dead. President Truman, his generals, and the scientists of Los Alamos agreed. If this weapon could end the war swiftly, it must be used. NNTHE B-29 crews continued their mysterious practice runs, unaware that within weeks they would be etched into history. They were not just preparing another bombing campaign, they were rehearsing Armageddon. August 6, 1945. 2:45 a.m. Tinian Island engines thundered in the humid darkness as the Enola Gay rolled down the coral runway. Inside sat 12 crewmen, each briefed only hours earlier on the mission's true nature. At its heart, nestled in the bomb bay, lay Little Boy, a 700-pound uranium bomb, the first of its kind ever prepared for combat. The target, Hiroshima, an industrial city of 350,000 people, home to shipyards, assembly plants, and a key military headquarters. NNTHE flight across the Pacific took 6 hours. At 8:15 a.m., with the city spread out below in morning sunlight, Colonel Paul Tibbets steadied the bomber at 31,000 feet. Bombardier Thomas Farabee adjusted his Norden bomb sight, locked onto the Aoi Bridge, and gave the order. The bomb bay doors opened, and Little Boy fell silently into history. 43 seconds later, the world ended for Hiroshima. A blinding flash lit the sky, brighter than the sun. Temperatures at ground zero surged to over 5,000 degrees Celsius. Steel girders vaporized. Shadows of people were seared onto walls in an instant. Within seconds, a mushroom cloud climbed 40,000 feet, towering above the stunned crew of the Enola Gay. On the ground, devastation was absolute. More than 70,000 people were killed instantly, incinerated, crushed, or burned alive. Tens of thousands more staggered through the ruins, their skin hanging in tatters, blinded by the light. Survivors described the horror. The river was filled with bodies, the water boiling around them. Whole districts disappeared in firestorms, hospitals destroyed, doctors among the dead. NNFOR, the Japanese military command. The first reports were unbelievable. Witnesses spoke of a single bomb leveling the city, yet Tokyo initially dismissed it as exaggeration. Only when American radio broadcasts confirmed it, and reconnaissance planes revealed a wasteland where Hiroshima had stood, did the truth sink in. One Japanese officer admitted, "We did not believe such a weapon could exist." From the air, the crew of the Enola Gay flew home in stunned silence. They had seen the birth of a new age, one where a single aircraft could annihilate an entire city. NNBUT, even as Hiroshima smoldered, Tokyo hesitated. The government remained divided, torn between surrender and defiance. The lesson of Hiroshima had not yet been enough. Another city would pay the price. August 9, 1945, 3:47 a.m. Tinian Island. Another B-29 lifted into the humid Pacific night. This time it was Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney. In its bomb bay rested Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device even more powerful than Little Boy. The target was Kokura, home to a major arsenal and weapons works. But fate and weather would decide otherwise. NNTHE flight was plagued with problems. One engine malfunctioned early. At Kokura, heavy smoke and cloud cover obscured the aiming point. 3 bombing runs failed, and Japanese anti-aircraft fire began to reach upward. With fuel running low, Sweeney made a desperate decision: divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., Bombardier Kermit Behan peered through the haze and found a gap in the clouds. The order was given. Fat Man dropped away, falling for 43 seconds before detonating over the Urakami Valley. The explosion yielded the equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. NNTHE blast tore through Nagasaki with brutal force. Unlike Hiroshima's flat plain, the city was set among hills and valleys, sparing some districts but intensifying destruction in others. The Mitsubishi arms factories and shipyards were obliterated. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a single searing instant. 40,000 people died immediately, with tens of thousands more injured or fatally burned. Survivors described a deafening roar, followed by a rolling fireball that turned day into night. One witness said, "The valley was swallowed by fire. The hills themselves seemed to collapse. A black mushroom cloud climbed into the sky as faraway villages watched in horror." Radio reports in Tokyo confirmed the unthinkable. A second city had been annihilated by a single bomb. The Japanese government could no longer deny the truth. America possessed a weapon of unimaginable power and the capacity to use it again and again. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito faced his ministers. Some still demanded resistance, insisting Japan fight to the last man. But the emperor, shaken by the ruin of his people, broke centuries of tradition. He spoke to the council. "To continue is to annihilate the Japanese nation. We must endure the unendurable." 3 days after Hiroshima, Nagasaki had forced the choice. The B-29 had not just bombed a city, it had ended an empire. August 15, 1945. Tokyo. Across the empire, radios crackled to life with a trembling voice no Japanese subject had ever heard before. Emperor Hirohito spoke directly to his people, announcing surrender. The war was over. After nearly 4 years of blood and fire, Japan had fallen. And at the center of its collapse stood a machine that had carried destruction farther than any aircraft in history. The B-29 Superfortress. Its legacy was measured in both triumph and terror. From June 1944 to August 1945, B-29s flew nearly 33,000 combat sorties. They dropped over 170,000 tons of bombs on Japan, burning 60 cities to the ground. More than 330,000 civilians perished in the fire raids alone, with millions left homeless. Hiroshima and Nagasaki added another 100,000 dead in moments, their shadows forever imprinted on walls and memories. No other aircraft had wielded such power. NNFOR American planners, the B-29 had fulfilled its promise. It had leapt oceans, struck the enemy homeland, and delivered victory without the need for a bloody invasion. The predicted casualties of Operation Downfall, perhaps 1 million Americans and several million Japanese, never came to pass. Veterans later reflected with grim clarity, if the B-29 ended the war, it saved more lives than it took. NNBUT for survivors in Japan, the legacy was anguish. Diaries, paintings, and oral testimonies spoke of firestorms that erased entire neighborhoods, of mushroom clouds that blotted out the sky. Children grew up among ruins, haunted by the sound of engines and the smell of smoke. The B-29 symbolized not only defeat, but apocalypse. After the war, the Superfortress entered legend. It served as the foundation for America's new Strategic Air Command, a bridge to the jet age, and a shadow over the Cold War that followed. In museums today, the Enola Gay and Boxcar sit behind ropes, their aluminum skins polished, their bomb bays empty. Visitors stand silently, torn between awe at their engineering and horror at their history. In Nin B-29, Superfortress was more than a bomber. It was a weapon that reshaped war itself, a machine that forced surrender, that saved lives while ending others, that opened the door to nuclear warfare. It was, as one historian wrote, the plane that brought both victory and the modern age of fear. NNTHE war ended in fire from the sky. The Superfortress had delivered it.